Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our webinar on choosing between the GRE and the LSAT, how to maximize success in law school admissions. Tonight, I will be speaking with Shaun Stiemsma. Both of us are senior tutors at Marks Education with in the neighborhood of 20 years of LSAT experience between the two of us. We will talk about the GRE, the LSAT, how to choose between them, and how to be strategic about that choice, as well as a little bit about how to prep for the whichever test you wind up taking. So to get started at a high level overview, let's talk about how you can use these tests. So in the United States, all law schools accept the LSAT. There has been a little bit of talk of that a small number of law schools might go test optional in the near future, but as of yet, the LSAT is, for the most part, the name of the game in law school admissions. You can use it anywhere as long as it's a law school in the US. But as of a couple of years ago, most law schools in the United States now are also accepting the GRE. The GRE is historically a grad school test that has been used for most grad school admissions other than law school, business school, and med school. And several years ago, business schools started accepting the GRE, and a little bit after that, law schools started accepting the GRE, and it's gained a lot of popularity in the last few years, where we're to the point now where it is the majority of law schools in the United States, including most of the top-ranked schools, will accept the GRE. So if you are considering applying to law school, for the most part, it means you can take either test. And there are some caveats to this. If you're interested in some specific schools that don't take the GRE, that makes a big difference. If you are interested in potentially applying to grad programs in addition to the LSAT, that can make a big difference. But for the most part, you can take either test, which means we want to think about which test should you take. But before we get into that in too much detail, let's talk about the LSAT in some detail. So Shaun, why don't you tell us some about the LSAT, everyone's favorite topic tonight?
Sure. So the LSAT is, for a lot of people, probably still the default. And we're going to talk about why either one might be a good option. But the LSAT is a test that is not a lot like an SAT or ACT. It has 3 sections, and only one of them, reading comprehension, is going to be more or less familiar to most test takers if you've taken other standardized tests. The other sections, logical reasoning and logic games, are really unique to this test and something that you'd have to think about preparing for specifically on that. Those 3 sections are the whole makeup of the test. There's one additional section that you would take on test day, but it's experimental and it can be any of the 3 section types. So what that means also is that there's no math on it whatsoever. So if you're the kind of student who hasn't taken math in a long time, that might seem really, really reassuring. On the other hand, if you're the kind of person who likes math, there's sort of feel of objectivity about it, that's not going to be on the LSAT, although the game section is pretty objective in the way that math is. Each section is the same, 35 minutes. They're all multiple choice with 5 options for each question. And you can take it on specific days, currently at home on your computer. And when you sign up for the test, I think you typically get a time range that you would be expected to start the test on that day. There's also a written portion, but you don't even have to do it on the same day, and it's ungraded. So it really is a fairly less significant part of the test as a whole.
So if it's not graded, law schools just, they look at it and that's it?
Yeah, and whether they do anything with it at all is probably in doubt, but it's something that I wouldn't want to just blow off and not do, because they can look at it.
That makes sense. I know I generally tell my LSAT students that the easiest way to compare the importance is that we may spend 50 or 100 or more hours preparing for the LSAT itself, and then maybe 1 at most for the essay.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, how about we talk some about the GRE next?
Yeah, so in some ways, this is going to be more like a typical standardized test that students might be used to. It starts with 2 written sections. They are graded. but they're not part of the composite score, which is kind of the core aspect that a school is going to look at. But they would see it. And so again, it's something that you certainly don't want to blow off. And because it is scored, it's more directly obvious if something doesn't go well on one of those essays. So you'll first see those 2 essays, and then there are 2 verbal and 2 quantitative sections, plus an experimental section, which, like on the LSAT, can be of either verbal or quant. And the sections of the test are adaptive. What that means is that you get a bank of questions from the bank of questions for your first verbal section. And then how you do on that determines the questions that you get on your second verbal set. So if you did really well, you'll get harder questions. If you didn't do as well, you'll get easier questions. And the same is true for quant. So the first quant section, the better you do, the harder section you'll get the second time. There is a mix of different question types for both the verbal and the quant. There's standard multiple choice. There are also ones where you have to fill in the blank. On the verbal section, sometimes you have to highlight things. And there's ones where you choose as many as apply. So like there's multiple answers to given math questions. You have to pick every answer that meets given criteria. And this test you can take any day. So it has a lot more flexibility in terms of when you take it. And you can take it on your computer, or you can take it in a GRE ETS testing lab instead.
All right, sounds good. Well, why don't we talk about how to get started in this process some then? So for most students, the best way to get started thinking about whether you want to take the GRE or the LSAT is to try them out. Take an unofficial practice test taken under realistic conditions. This might be proctored, maybe by us, or it might be taken on your own at home, but it should be done fully timed and following the rules of the test as much as possible. So don't use a graphing calculator on your GRE. Don't have a dictionary near you near the LSAT. Not that it would be of much help. Use official digital practice tests for these that match the format of the real thing. And you want to take both of them relatively close together. It doesn't need to be in the same day or 2 days next to each other, but ideally within about a month of each other, just because you expect your abilities are likely to grow and change over time, and you want to get reliable, comparable baselines on them that you can use to see which one seems like a better test for you. And you should ideally do this fairly early on in the process before you do a lot of studying, because when you start studying for either test, you're likely to, at least if you're studying well, get a lot of the low-hanging fruit. You'll get a lot of the really easy improvement right away, and taking your baselines after that can make it a little more difficult to tell between the tests, because you might just coincidentally have done a little more improvement on one than the other, which doesn't mean that you are better situated for that one, just that at that moment you are. So if you take them rather cold, as it will, like without doing a ton of work on either test, even no work on either test potentially, that really can give you the best initial impression of where your abilities lie with the tests.
Yeah, especially with that, like you're making an investment, right? Like the more that you put in it, and the 2 tests are not really close enough that you'd be sort of doing both at the same time, right? So you're already then sort of making a decision to invest. Yeah. So like I too, I would say, like, you know, if you want to like familiarize yourself with the question types, that's about it. So that you're not just like completely shocked by something. But yeah, really nothing more than that is even worthwhile because of how different the 2 tests are in terms of preparing.
I know whenever I did my first practice LSAT, I didn't even know the section timings going into it. So it was a much longer test back then. Well, so then after you've taken your baseline test, then you compare the scores. And the ETS website, ETS is the institution that runs the GRE, they have a comparison tool that looks like this that you can use to compare the scores. You put in your verbal and your quant score from your practice test here, and it will give you a predicted LSAT score that you can then compare with the LSAT score you got on your practice LSAT. This score is really the one that matters. One thing that's a little odd about this process is it would be intuitive that you would think you should be relying on the percentiles, the percentage of students that got a score of a certain amount or higher on either test. And that's really not the most helpful way of looking at. And the main reason for this is that the verbal section of the GRE is weighted more strongly than the quantitative section. Both are important, but the verbal section is more important, perhaps in the neighborhood of twice as important for the purpose of law school admissions. And this is something that may vary somewhat from school to school, but is generally true on a broad level and is reflected by this comparison tool. The essay scores are reported, like law schools get them whenever if and when you take the GRE, send in your scores, but they're not included as part of this conversion because they're only marginally important for admissions decisions, similar to on the LSAT, like Shaun was explaining, the least important part of the test. So once you have your scores between the two tests, either you'll have done a lot better on one, in which case the test that you study for is likely obvious, the one that you're better at to begin with, or you maybe did about the same on both, in which case it's a harder decision, but luckily one in which the information we're providing now will hopefully be a lot more helpful, in that you'll want to consider the very specific differences between the tests, which one you like more, whether you think you'll be comfortable or fearful of getting up to speed on that math on the GRE, etc. Let's see. So some specifics about how to decide when they're close. First, consider whether you might want to apply to non-law grad programs. If you are applying to a joint degree program, many such programs will only require an LSAT, but others may require a GRE or something else. And if you might be applying to programs besides law as a standalone program, perhaps you're pursuing multiple grad options, or you're not for sure what you want to do, but you know you like being in school, then consider the GRE because of its flexibility. Second, check if any of the law schools you might be interested in require the LSAT. Not a ton of them do anymore, but some still do. And so if your favorite school wants an LSAT, you'll need an LSAT. Third, think about your math background. The math on the GRE quantitative sections is not super high level. There's no calculus, there's no advanced statistics. It's really algebra and geometry. It's math that most students will have seen all or nearly all of in the course of a routine high school education. And so think, how strong were you in math back then? How long has it been since you've done a lot of math? Are you a math person? Did you like it? Do you look forward to doing more? Fourth, think about flexibility. The GRE provides more in terms of when and how often you can take the test. The GRE can be taken on almost any day of the year, whereas the LSAT is offered about every month or two. So still fairly regularly, but not quite as often and on specific dates instead of just whenever you feel like it, more or less like the GRE. Next, do you need a lot of practice tests? The LSAT has a nearly unlimited amount of official high-quality released practice tests. There are in the neighborhood of 90 of them in the current format. And so that is an amount of test material that very few people will find insufficient. An average test taker will go through less than 1/3 of that to study for the test. To compare, the GRE offers a much smaller number of released practice tests. There are 2 practice tests in the official GRE book that are in paper form and a little outdated. There are 2 free digital GRE practice tests on their website, and there are 3 paid practice tests on their website. And it's really only the 3 paid ones that are modern enough that they really feel the same as the GRE feels to take now, at least from our experiences and everything that we've heard from recent students. And so if you are the kind of person that really likes to grind through a large amount of practice material, consider that with the GRE, that will be difficult, at least in terms of realistic test simulation material. There are nearly never-ending practice problems for the GRE, just not in the format of official tests, not put together and in software that allows you to take it online and have the adaptive nature of the test. And compare with the LSAT, where there's tons. There is almost unlimited online digital practice tests in the format of the real thing. And then lastly, just which test did you like more? You're very likely going to be spending a lot of time with this test. Most people put in dozens to hundreds of hours studying for getting ready for taking practice tests and whatnot for the tests they wind up taking. And it'll be a lot less painful of an experience if you don't hate the test that you're working on. So if there was one that you liked a lot more, that matters. And even if your scores are pretty close, if you liked one, or even a little bit less from super close, if there was one you liked a lot more, or you feel more comfortable with, feel like maybe you could do better on, that definitely should have some weight. So I feel like I've been rambling on for a while. What do you think, Shaun? Did I miss any important points here?
No, I think the math question is a good one to bring up when you're thinking about what tests to do, because I've talked to people who just feel intimidated by math because maybe they haven't taken a math course in 4 years and feel like, well, I don't want to do that test because of the math that it's going to require. And it is true that, for instance, most tests, you would need to know the difference between the formula for the circumference and area of a circle. If you don't have those down, yeah, you're probably going to miss that question. But the math is more about logic and numbers and strategy than it is just about straight memorizing all kinds of math information. And so in that way, obviously there's a strong emphasis on logic on the LSAT, but the math, yeah, most people are going to have it in their background. It's just how far in your background. And once you kind of master a relatively small set of information or recall a relatively small set, it's more about how you can use your math logic to work through the problem in most cases. Does that seem fair?
I think that's right. Yeah. And I think it's also fair to say there's a good amount of creativity in how you kind of deploy math knowledge on these kinds of questions. The very few of them are as simple as just plug values into a formula that you have memorized. Nearly all of them require a little more nuance and thinking a little more deeply about what the problem means, how it works, that kind of thing.
Yeah, like what you said about creativity. There's a little bit of a like Gordian knot aspect to some of them. If you can cut through the problem, you don't have to do all of the hard kind of math work to it. Yeah, I mean, I think that's the only thing there that I really kind of feel like I hear a lot from students when they're thinking about it, like being intimidated by math or worried about if they'll be able to handle that aspect.
Yeah, I think I agree. Well, then let's talk some about the preparation process. So we'll go into some detail about some of the differences, how you might get ready for the LSAT or the GRE specifically. But to start with, let's think about when to actually do this. So when to start preparing depends on a lot of factors. And the biggest one is just, when are you starting to think about this? If you are watching this relatively close to when we're recording it in June and you want to apply to law school in September or October, you should start studying tomorrow. If you are watching it later and maybe applying in a future cycle, then that depends. Most people like to give themselves at least 3 or 4 months to study before taking their first official LSAT or GRE. And that doesn't mean that you're putting in 20 or 30 hours a week the whole time. That just means that it's, for most people, a lot more comfortable to be able to study for, say, 5 to 10 hours a week for months than super intensively over a shorter period of time. And a lot of people studying for these tests are working full time, or they're interning over the summer, or they're taking classes full time. And so you might not have the kind of time to put in huge amounts of hours on a weekly basis into these tests. And that's fine. You don't need to. It takes a fair amount of time overall to get ready for them, but it is totally fine and appropriate to spread that time out. On the other hand, if you do have a ton of time available, perhaps if it's the summer and you're not working full time or taking classes, or it's winter break, or you're taking a semester off, or whatever else, and you have a lot of time available, then you certainly can spread it out more. But it's very possible to get comfortable and ready for these tests in 2 to 3 months in that kind of time period, like if you have the time available to spend. And at that point, we likely are talking about a more intensive study schedule. That might be a 15-hour a week kind of study schedule or a 20-hour a week kind of schedule. Does that sound about right, Shaun?
Yeah. And I mean, obviously there's a lot of variables in play there, but I think you certainly can do the shorter run up if you can really do it in an intense way. Um, One of the things that I'm wondering, just looking at this, we're thinking about, say, the 3 to 4 months, but that would be before you're taking the official test the first time, not the run up to when you want to like submit your scores and you need to
Mhm.
have them for your application. Is that right?
Yeah, that's a great point. So that is something people should be keeping in mind as they plan out their study trajectory, is that the hope in going into one of these tests is that you can take it once and be done with it. But for a lot of people, it winds up the case that planning on taking it again is helpful. Um, Unlike the SAT and the ACT, where the great majority of students that are well prepared take it multiple times, for the LSAT and the GRE, I'd estimate with my students, it's more like half or so that take it multiple times. About half are done with once, half take it multiple times. Is that about the same as your experience?
Yeah, and certainly you don't like want to have a plan like some high school students will, where you like take every sitting. Um, this is just not a good way to plan it. You want to be strategic about when you take it. You want to be sure you're ready. If you can do it once and be done, that's great. But you want to give yourself, I think, a window of time that you have the option of doing a retake should things not go as you hope when you go in and take it the first time.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, and I know there are some limits on how much you can take these tests, which is one of several reasons why it's important to be strategic about when you take them, and also a reason why you definitely don't want to take a real test as your baseline, even though you could, I guess.
Not recommended.
Uh, so maybe Shaun,
Yeah,
you could tell us some about the more specifics about how to prep for these tests.
sure. So for the LSAT, like we said, the first thing you're going to want to do is take that baseline test, see where your score is, think about what your goals are from there. For most test takers, they're going to have to build skills, and the first place for almost everybody is in the logic games. It's just an odd test section. It's something that most people aren't used to doing, and so you're going to start for most people in that section. There's lots of books out there you can choose from. You want to work through one. You want to learn the game types, learn how to set up, to do the diagram, to work through the different question types, and really get that down so that you know exactly what you're doing on that section. And then once you've kind of mastered it, you can get better and better at getting the timing down, because you also have to do it pretty quickly. And initially, when you figure out how to do it properly, it's going to slow you down. So then it takes time to sort of build your speed up. Most people will have to spend at least some time doing reading comp. The reading is very high level and the questions are complex. And so this is something that takes, for some people, maybe doing a little bit of reading outside to just build their reading skills generally. But definitely something that you're going to need to practice, especially to differentiate between answer choices that will often seem really, really close to each other. The section, other than logic games, that I'll usually spend most time with test takers on is the logical reasoning, where the questions, again, I think are just less familiar to most people. And so becoming familiar with the different types is really important in that case. And how do I approach? What are the different techniques for these different questions? And a lot of those are not necessarily intuitive. So you really have to remind yourself, I want to do it this way. I don't want to just go and read those answer choices. I want to first figure out where I see the weakness in this argument, or whatever. And that will help you then to know strategically how to get those questions right so that they don't just feel subjective, which a lot of times is where people will start with the logical reasoning. And then all of them take real practice in timing. And that's where having so many practice tests is really helpful for the LSAT, because the timing for really almost everybody that I've ever worked with has been an issue. Nobody is like done and has 10 minutes to spare to just kind of hang out. Everybody's really working pretty hard right up to the time that time is up, even people who are going for 99th percentile type scores. So yeah, anything you would add for prepping the LSAT?
I think it's interesting that you mentioned the point about students, many initially looking at some of the logical reasoning questions as subjective. And I know something I tell a lot of my students is, I would love it if we could find an LSAT question that I thought, after thinking about, was a bad question, like one that really did have multiple arguably correct answers or was not written well. And I just don't know that I have looking looking at thousands of questions. The LSAT is just such a high quality test. But it would really make my day if I found a question that I thought was truly subjective.
Yeah. I wish that I could remember, because I feel like I had one that a student really complained about, and I was like, yeah, I can kind of see, but I could still explain why the
Right.
best answer was the best answer, right? And
Mhm.
so there's something important that happens when you're building your skills for this, when you stop wanting to argue back,
Mhm.
right? When you want to argue back and say, no, I think B is a better answer, then you haven't figured out quite what it's doing yet, because it is that solid.
Mhm. Right. At a certain level, a lot of it is just math in a way. It's
Yeah.
almost pure logic.
Yeah, and that the importance of the word choices having that like mathematical certainty to them,
Mhm.
like must. Okay, if it says must, you don't read that as what it really means in your normal way of thinking about it. We've got to think about it that is absolute,
Mhm.
right, in a mathematical way.
Well, absolutely. The I can I have a vague memory of someone being just infuriated by and the correctness of an answer choice playing off the difference in meaning between most and many.
Oh
Um,
yeah, absolutely.
so yes, if you like very like close nitpicky detail reading, then LSAT is definitely your kind of test. Um, but why don't we talk some about how to get ready for the GRE?
Yeah, so again, we're going to start out with that baseline and see where you are on each section. That would also give you an idea of how much time you want to spend on the two different section types. For verbal, there's a lot of vocab memorization that's going to go in. Almost half of the questions are based on recognizing vocabulary. The test doesn't tend to do just super obscure vocabulary for its own sake, but there are definitely going to be words that every test taker is not going to memorize the first time that they look at a GRE. They're just not all common words. So getting some kind of form of vocab practice is going to be really, really important. Passage reading techniques are also a significant part of it. The passages tend to be short, and test takers will want to just skim them really fast, but you have to slow yourself down, read carefully. Some test takers will even want to just do some practice difficult reading on their own. A lot of the passages come from academic journals and writing like that. And so just getting yourself used to doing this higher level reading can also be an important thing to do. And of course, there's lots of strategies for the way the questions work. The questions, as we talked about before, they're different types. And so a straight multiple choice question is going to be handled differently than one with interdependent answers that have multiple parts. And so there's lots of strategy to learn there as well. For a lot of future test takers that I'll work with, math is where they're going to start, because even if they have been taking math classes, they probably haven't been on the topics that the GRE tests a lot. So for a lot of test takers, there's a quick run up of review of all kinds of math to just bring that back to the front of your mind and think about how to apply it. And then there's lots of practice on questions, because just knowing those formulas is not going to be enough. They're going to make you manipulate them, think about them in terms of each other. And so really practicing a lot of questions is important. So the memorization piece is important, because if you don't have it, you can't do it. But you then have to think about, how can I use these things to get from what the question is giving me to what the answer is that I have to give. Of course, you're going to be limited to a small number of practice tests. That's just unavoidable. And so you're going to want to be careful about how and when you take them. And especially those 3 best tests that are available on the ETS website. You want to be careful about when you use those, and take the other tests that you can to give you at least a sense of how the timing works, even if the content doesn't feel like it exactly matches up with the more recent tests. Yeah. Anything you'd add on that, Ryan?
Yeah, one thing to follow up on about being strategic about the limited number of tests. I know unlike most of the other tests that we teach, where doing practice sections is such an integral part of prepping for the test that you kind of sprinkle around, doing some in the middle, some near the end, here and there. With the GRE, because there are so few, I find with most of the people that I work on, it winds up being doing very few practice test sections until fairly close to the end, and then a lot of them. And so I know this is something that might vary a little bit from person to person, but I find for the GRE at least that in getting ready for the test, you can kind of take how long you want doing a lot of the skills development work, but then eventually you get to a point where you kind of have to commit that you're going to take the real test soon, because then you're going to start doing practice tests and you're going to run out soon. So once you get in that kind of final phase for most students, you kind of have to commit to taking the test relatively soon, one way or the other. Do you find that as well?
Oh yeah, I mean, once you do that baseline, right? Because you want to do one of the three for the baseline, because it's the only way to really get an accurate picture. You've only got 2 tests left, so you really need to think about, how do I schedule when I'm going to take those, and you want to be conscious of that from when you start. And if I'm working with somebody, I want to feel that it's worth it, right, to take that practice test before I'm going to have them do it. I want to know that they're going to see a significant change in their score, and that they're close to being where they want to be in terms of their overall improvement before I'm going to use that test.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, how about, why don't we talk some about the kinds of things that that we can do to help along with this process?
Yeah, so we can help get set up with baseline testing, especially if you are local to the offices. We have, correct, Ryan, at some of our offices, you can do in-person testing at this point.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we do in person and remote stuff over Zoom.
And so that can help, especially if you might have a hard time creating a test atmosphere for yourself. That's an important thing to be able to do. Then looking at what those scores look like, but also we would have a conversation with you about, well, how did that feel? What did you come away from each test feeling? Did you feel like, yeah, maybe this wasn't great, but I feel like this feels comfortable to me? Or maybe just like, boy, I never want to go through that again. That was like a horrifying experience and I'd like to not experience it. So being able to have that conversation, that it's more than just what are the numbers, but also who are you and what are your preferences, what's your experience, that's going to make a difference in terms of how you're going to be able to do on the test. And then, of course, we are always working through preparing for what you're going to encounter in terms of, I mean, obviously, especially the content, but the format, the structure, all of those things are things that we're going to work through with, and really be able to customize to what you need as well, which is a really significant thing, because if you just get a book, right, it's just going to take you through what the book writers assume everybody needs to know, and that may not really be that useful for you individually or personally, because your needs may be slightly different than what's standard. So that would also be part of what we would do. What are the best materials for you to use, and what are the best materials overall? That's another important piece of it. And then there's things about both of these tests that are just really challenging, and it's not going to be the same for everybody, but we have experience to be able to not only know how to solve these ourselves, but also what helps people to be able to go from feeling really bewildered by a question type to being able to say, okay, so maybe I'm going to save this question for last, but I have a strategy. I know what I can do to work through it. And that's something that we're going to help you to feel more confident on every aspect of what you're going to have to do, whether that's even doing things like picking which questions to spend more time on, which ones to put off. All of that is stuff that we're going to work through with you. And we're really trying to think about not just what's going to be the fastest path to the highest score, although certainly we know that you want that, but also what is going to work for you. So like, we're not going to tell you, oh, well, you have, a 50-hour-a-week internship, plus you're taking a class, but you need to do 30 hours of prep every week, because if you don't, you're not going to be successful on this test. And if you go on the internet, you'll hear horror stories about people, like how much they had to prep to be able to be successful on these tests, because we want to think about you as a whole person and what's going to be your best path to success on the test.
Excellent. And I think one thing that is helpful to maybe emphasize about the kind of custom bespoke nature of this is that it varies heavily person to person, kind of how much help you need. I know I've worked with students that wanted to meet maybe once or twice to get some tips about like a study plan from the beginning, and then check in later, go over some techniques, make sure they were on the right path. And then all the way to the other side of people that want to meet twice a week for 6 months because they want absolutely extensive help with every possible thing to do the best that is imaginable that they could do, and lots of places in between. So it really is much more customized and individualized than reading a book or even taking a class would be.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I've had people for both tests that we meet, then we set up a plan, and then yeah, if you're somebody who is motivated to do things yourself and you're able to kind of discipline yourself that way, that's a great option to be able to work through that. You need kind of maybe less support along the way. And then yeah, there's 2 times a week type as well.
Mhm. Well, I realize I probably should have mentioned this earlier, but if anyone has any questions that they'd like for us to see if we can tackle, please do message them to me. I am Ryan. You'll see me on the Zoom chat. I will put up our contact us slide for a minute while we see if any of those come in, but please do email us also if you have any questions that you want to ask us but don't want to ask on the Zoom chat, or if you are watching this later and have questions that you'd like to ask. We are happy to help. Also check out our website, markseducation.com. We have various resources. We write blogs about these tests. Sometimes we put videos up. This webinar itself will be up on the website relatively soon. So do check it out and see all what we have to offer. Let me see if I have to get out of the screen share to check messages. Okay, we do have one in. I wouldn't mind tackling this one. This is, what are the restrictions on retaking? Okay, so both of the tests do have some restrictions on one's ability to take them multiple times, but in general, the GRE is a lot more flexible. The GRE allows one to take it 21 days after the last time they took it, and you're allowed to take the GRE up to 5 times in a given year, which we don't recommend, but it is certainly a nice peace of mind to know that you can. The LSAT, by contrast, is something that you're only allowed to take up to 3 times in a given year, and 5 times in a 5-year time period, and 7 times in your life. And this is a limit that's changed a lot over the last few years. It was a little more restrictive several years in the past, and then they got rid of the restriction entirely for a period of time around the time the LSAT was switching to its digital format. Then they briefly brought it back, and then they got rid of it again whenever pandemic happened, and then they brought it back a few months ago. So that's what it is right now. Who knows what it'll be in a year or two. So it's hard to say for sure if those limits will actually affect someone, but just knowing that you can only take it 3 times in a year currently is a little bit restricted. That should be enough for the great majority of students. One thing to note also about retaking for the LSAT is the existence of score preview as an option. The LSAT has a service they offer. It's a paid service that you can pay a little bit to get the privilege of seeing your score before it becomes official. And you can only do it before the first time you take the test. But if you do sign up for it, then after you take the test, once your score comes out 2 or 3 weeks after you take the test, they'll show you your score, and you'll have a few days to decide if you want to make that score count and be official and part of your law school record that'll get sent to law schools, or if you want to cancel it in the same way that if you had decided halfway through taking the test you were sick and couldn't continue and had to cancel. So if you do cancel, law schools see that you canceled but have no idea why and tend not to care, assuming you don't cancel several tests. It does still count as one of the times that you're allowed to take the test, though. I personally don't think I've ever had a student cancel their scores with it, but I have had many sign up for it just for the peace of mind that knowing you have the option makes the test taking experience a little bit lower pressure, a little bit less stressful. Um,
That's not an option on the GRE, correct?
That's right. The GRE, when you finish answering the last question or run out of time in the last section, the GRE will ask you, would you like to make your scores permanent or never see them and no one else will ever see them? And you have to, in that moment, decide. And unless something egregious happened during the test, you should make them official and see them, and they will then be official. So the upside is you get your score before you even get off of your computer when you're taking it with the GRE, not weeks later, like in the LSAT. But
yeah,
there's a little more pressure to that decision at the end.
Yeah, I remember that moment when I took my GRE years and years ago, that like, okay, yeah, it's official.
Mm-hmm. Another question we have, what if I have accommodations for testing? Shaun, do you want to tackle this one?
Yeah, both ETS and the LSAT, I've worked with people who have had testing accommodations. The most common one is the time and a half accommodation, and even the practice tests can be set up to be taken with that accommodation in place. That doesn't guarantee that you get it, right? On both the GRE and LSAT website, but you can take them that way. There's application process to go through, but everybody that I've worked with that's had to do it has gotten their accommodations approved. Mostly people who had them set up through their college already. Many who had it in high school have had it on SAT, ACT kind of tests. And yeah, it's not really been an issue. There are some other possible accommodations as well. I don't know the full package of different options for that, Ryan, if you know more about that, but the one I've seen most is the time and a half, and it's not been like a hassle for people to get it in my experience.
Yeah, and that is the one that the great majority of people get. There are lots of other ones for more specific circumstances. You might, for instance, let's say if you are diabetic and might need to test your blood sugar, you might have start-stop privileges where you're allowed to take a break in the middle of a section if you need to. There are some people that might have the accommodation that they have the test spoken, like they have headphones and it's read aloud to them. There are a very limited number of people that have an accommodation that allows them to take the test on paper, which makes the test for the GRE at least a lot different. But it's the kind of thing for most people. It's just, if you need something specific, and if so, you're probably going to get it. And if you don't know anything about that, then you don't need anything specific and don't need to worry about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know I've had, whatever accommodations are needed there. I mean, I know I've had students who even had like as much time as they needed between sections as an accommodation. So there's all kinds of different things. And the companies, I think in general, want to work with people, whatever their needs are.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I think that about does it for us. Thanks so much, everyone, for tuning in or for watching this later on. And let me put up the slide one more time in case anyone wants to jot down our email to send us a question now or later on. We are happy to talk more about the LSAT and the GRE endlessly even. These things are interesting to us for some reason.
For sure.
Thanks, Shaun.
Thanks.